everyone. My name is Mike Lopez, and I'm the co at the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families, and here at Apple. On behalf of the center, we'd like to welcome you all to the presentation today, Childcare Search and Decision Making with Hispanic Families, New Findings and New Horizons. We're excited to be hosting today's webinar event from two of here in the Bethesda office and up in Cambridge in the Boston area. For those of you joining us via GoToWebinar, you should be able to see us via the live stream. Today we're delighted to have two presenters with us, Dr. Colleen Vesely, who's an assistant professor at George Mason University and is here in our Bethesda office joining us, and Dr. Yoon-Suk Ha, an assistant professor at Boston University in the School of Social Work, is joining us in the Cambridge office. We have this joint virtual session. We're very fortunate to have both of these researchers with us today because they complement each other in terms of their qualitative and quantitative approach to studying child care selection, particularly with respect to a focus on Latina and immigrant population. They both published some very interesting papers in this topic area recently, and we're going to hear about some of that today. They'll also talk about how their own work will help illustrate some of the key issues relevant to the broader research agenda that can inform the field on critical child care related issues. And it's kind of a point of departure as we like to think about it. So I'd like to provide a little overview of our agenda for today. First, we'll start with a brief overview of the work of the center and how it relates to the topic of child care and decision making for Hispanic families. We'll then give our presenters an opportunity to provide a very brief overview of their work, along with some key theoretical areas of relevance and implications for future research and or policy, which I think is kind of the meat and potatoes of what we hope to get out of today. This will be followed by an in-depth and interactive discussion about today's topic. Dr. Aaron Baumgartner, my colleague up in Cambridge, a senior research analyst here at APP in our Cambridge office, will help moderate the interactive discussion. We've prepared a set of questions for our panelists, but we also strongly encourage people who are here live, I say here collectively, here in Bethesda and here in Cambridge, and those online, to ask questions and comment and make comments as well, because we really do want to have this as a real interactive discussion today. So we're very fortunate that we have lots of policy, programmatic, and research colleagues in the audience, either in person and or online. So I think there's a lot of potential to have some really rich discussion amongst the group. Attendees on the phone are going to be muted, but can use the chat box on your screen if you'd like to send any questions for our speakers or comments, or if you have any logistical issues with your connection. We also have, for those of you here in person, either in Bethesda or Cambridge, if you have questions that you'd like to raise, please write them on we have some index cards that are strategically placed around. That way we can come up and Julie and I can, you can pass them up and Julie and I can sort through them and identify which questions that we'll load. For those who are Twitter aficionados, we have a hashtag Hispanic ECE for our Twitter handle. So those are some of the housekeeping logistical issues. And just before proceeding, I'd like to point out a little disclaimer that the views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, the Administration for Children and Families, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, our funders. Also, today's presentation is being recorded. After the presentation ends, we'll be uploading the presentation to the Hispanic Center's website, and we'll also be sharing an update to all those of you who are present or registered on the webinar. If you have colleagues or friends who were on vacation or not otherwise able to make it today, but are interested in the content, please feel free to share this afterwards. So before we dive into the real heart of the discussion, I'd like to just give you a little bit of an overview of the work of the center. The center is, we like to think of it as a hub of research to help programs and policies better serve low-income Hispanic children and families. And our work is organized around three main priority areas: poverty and economic self-sufficiency, healthy marriage and responsible fatherhood, and then early care and education, which obviously today's topic is more about early care and education, but also touches upon economic self-sufficiency in terms of child care as a support for parents. So we do the work in three primary ways. First, by advancing a cutting-edge research agenda across these three priority areas. Lots of different efforts that some of you may have seen some of our research briefs that have been released earlier. Second, by building an extensive network of partners, which includes supporting emerging scholars, and we have one current scholar here, Wyatt, and a scholar from last year, Marta, who are here. So our work supporting emerging scholars through a fellowship program that those of you in person we have on the table, we have a flyer on our fellowship program, so we encourage people who might be interested for next year when we have the applications out again. We also have done a number of different efforts around mentoring and networking. We have one following this event for the people who are in person. And then the development of knowledge base and tools for the broader research and program and policy community. So a lot of things going on. And today's webinar is just one part of this set of capacity building activities. By shedding light on child care research, providing tools to researchers and policymakers and practitioners, we further build a knowledge base that in turn can be used to help inform programs and policies serving children and families around the country. And then the third part of the work that we do at the center is really implementing an innovative communication and dissemination strategy. It's critical that not only that we do the work, do good new work, but also that it gets out there and it gets in the hands of key stakeholders such as yourselves and others. So now I'd like to hand the presentation over to my colleague, Erin, who is Erin and Julia to my left here, probably responsible for all this. They did all the heavy lifting. And Erin's going to talk a little bit about why we're here for today's presentation before we start into the actual discussion. Erin.
Great. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about why we decided to host the webinar today. And the first part of that question is related to the statistics, which are up on the screen, which many of you probably already know about, but are worth repeating. So you'll see up there it says 1 in 4 of all U.S. children are Hispanic, and roughly 1/3 of these Hispanic children live in poverty. The majority of them were born in the United States, yet about half of them have parents who were foreign-born. And so we just mentioned these few very sort of brief statistics to keep in mind as we talk through today's topic, not only to emphasize that Hispanic children are one of the fastest growing racial, ethnic minority groups in the United States, but they're a heterogeneous group, and so we'll be talking about that today, trying to think about the diversity within this group of Hispanic children. And then just to keep in mind that because of the high rate of poverty, a lot of them are eligible for government-funded programs, including early childhood programs, which is the focus of today's topic. So again, a lot of you have seen this. We'll bring it up again, but it just seems like it's worth repeating. And then the other thing that we wanted to point you to is this logic model, which is, I know it's small here for the people in person, but basically what this is intended to point out is that the search and decision-making process for all families, particularly Hispanic families, is complex, and it, there are a lot of things happening at once, and these things also change over time. So families are making decisions. You'll see this on the left-hand side of the screen, not only based on their family dynamics and what's in the best interest of themselves and their children, but also based on community and contextual factors, everything from their employment circumstances to the availability of quality child care in their neighborhoods. And then ultimately, as we move right in this diagram, you'll see that these factors come together to influence decisions about which arrangements parents are selecting for their children. And then ultimately, what we care about most is that these arrangements then have consequences for child and family outcomes. So today when we talk about, there's a lot that can be said about this diagram in and of itself, and we are going to get into some of those details in a little bit with Colleen and UNICEF talking about their research, but I know that we also have a lot of people here who have done work at various stages in this logic model, so we're really hoping that other people can step in and bring up some of those topics. So I think we wanted to keep this background section brief, that way we could jump into discussion. And so with that said, I'm happy to hand it over to Colleen next. We've asked Colleen and UNICEF just to prepare a few words also to get us started in terms of what their research focuses on, and then also some of their biggest takeaways in terms of where the research is right now and what's sort of on the horizon for upcoming areas of exploration. So Colleen, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Erin. And I apologize for my voice. I'm getting over a cold. So my research is really grounded in working with, or working to understand the ecologies of children and families' lives and the intersection of these ecologies, and really thinking about childcare and family, and how culture and poverty shape these contexts and, in turn, families' experiences. So much of my work related to low-income Latino immigrant families and childcare is qualitative, in which I've used in-depth interviews as well as ethnographic field observations to understand the lived experiences of these. My work that's most relevant to today's presentation was initially funded by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation through the Child Care Scholars Grant Program, and I see many students around the room here, and I would encourage you to look into that program. It's been wonderful connecting with others who are doing like work. This work shed light on the complex processes, including both cultural and structural components of childcare decision-making. So when we think about the cultural components, we might think about values and beliefs, or even more specifically, we might think about the desire of Latino parents to have their children maintain their Spanish language. When we think about the structural components, we might think about access and affordability, or really the ability to find potentially a bilingual program in one's community. In addition, this work pointed to the important role of childcare for low-income Latino families that move beyond the educational and financial functions. So when we think about the educational functions of childcare, we're thinking about really how we're supporting children's development, and the financial functions being those that support parents' employment. And some of the work I've done sort of looked at this other piece, which others have coined as the social function of childcare, and really supporting families as they navigate their early childhood social safety net. So beyond childcare, thinking of other aspects of that safety net that really support children and families in terms of thriving. Most recently, I've been engaged in a community-based participatory research project in a local community with a group of Latinas. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with CBPR, it's an orientation to research. It's not a method, but it's often used in the public health field. It's a participatory and collaborative process that works to empower participants through community-driven research and action. It really aims to change the balance of power, shifting the power from researchers back to the community, and usually begins with a community-identified social problem. CBPR engenders a mutual ownership of the research process, data, decisions about how the data are used, how the findings are disseminated. And so in this most recent work that I've been doing with colleagues at Mason, Bethany Latique and Rachel Goodman, childcare, among other issues, has emerged as a really important area of focus for these families. Preliminary data from this work indicate a few areas of challenge specific to childcare in relation to care for infant and toddlers, children with special needs, and finding childcare during the summer. And these areas of challenge are further exacerbated by other contextual issues, including housing, so things like overcrowding, employment and economic needs, as well as mental health issues. And so just thinking about this complexity, I'll give you one example. So families who are living in overcrowded homes who are without summer care, you can imagine 3 families living in a 3-bedroom apartment, 1 family per bedroom, and they don't have child care, and they may not feel comfortable going out in the community. What does care look like for those families, particularly during the summer? We were asked to give a sense of the most critical areas of the knowledge base in relation to Latino families and child care. And considering the literature in this area specific to child care decision-making, I think that we finally realized that the child care decision-making process is a complex one, and we saw from Bobby Weber's work and others the complexity of that, and one that includes preferences and priorities of parents, as well as constraints and facilitators to selecting preferred care, and even the amount of time that it takes to make these selections. And this is even more complex as we layer various diversities related to family situatedness in society onto this process. Given this complexity, I think we're still trying to figure out how do we measure this? How do we look at it even further? How do we balance smaller, more nuanced and descriptive studies with larger, more generalizable research? And how do we use these varied types of studies to inform the field and our practice? Along these lines, and even more specific to low-income Latino families, I think we're starting to get a decent handle on the aspects of child care decision-making that are comparable and those that are unique to other populations. Across most parents, across all SES, there is a high value placed on quality, regardless of whether or not that quality is available, that quality child care is available. Among low-income parents, in particular, we see limited options for care a lot of the time, limited time to make decisions for care, learning about care from family, friends, and neighbors. And even more specific to Latino families, we see the importance of thinking about country of origin experiences in relation to child care, the real importance of family social networks, how they're using those networks. Are those networks available to them? How is information being shared across networks? As well as languages spoken by providers, and sometimes challenges with documentation. Finally, we were asked to share our thoughts on pressing areas of future research. And so my ideas on this are related to both the literature, but also some of the things that are coming up in my current work with low-income immigrant mothers in particular. And so first, increasing our understanding of the child care decision-making experiences among low-income Latina immigrants, specifically with infants and toddlers, seems important, not only from some of what I'm finding in my own work, but also we see the recent efforts of the National Center for Early Head Start and Child Care Partnerships really focusing on this area, in particular to Latino families. And second, continuing to grapple with and trying to understand through examining in a systematic way how child care is situated within the complexity of families' lives. And I'm thinking of the work of Gina Adams is here and Heather Sandstrom in terms of the stability work, right? And looking at stability not just among child care, but in other areas of families' lives. And that this is really complex, and child care is but one thing, one very important thing in this web of complexity. And really particular to Latino families, when we think about these complexities, we can think about things like documentation, culture of origin experiences, and language that may make their experiences even more unique. So with that, I will pass things on to Yunsuk.
Thank you, Colleen. Hi. So let me get started. I have 5 minutes to talk about it. So my work in this area comes from my interest in how immigrant families with children access and utilize the resources available through policies and programs and make their decisions on child care. So the most recently published work that I have done is to examine the impact of parental immigration status on child care choices. Because we are interested, in the Hispanic population, as Erin pointed out. The Hispanic children are fastest growing group of young children, and then they're heterogeneous group, and then they're disadvantaged in multiple ways. And then we are also considered the immigration status, because a significant number of Latino children had immigrant parents. So we thought that their immigration status might explain some the differences in care choices compared to other ethnic groups, because family immigration status affects not only their trust or fear for the child care system, but also the eligibility for certain benefits. So in collaboration with Dr. Martin Ibarra at the University of Chicago, we analyzed data from Los Angeles Family and Neighborhood Survey, called LFN, because this data allow us to identify families' immigration status, legal status, including undocumented status.
So we constructed a measure that combines race and immigration status, and that examined how the maternal race and immigration status affect their choice of care. And then we found, similar to all other previous literature, Latina mothers are less likely to use formal child care, but undocumented mothers had the lowest usage rate for formal care. And then I'm also currently working with Massachusetts CCDF administrative data with my colleagues at Brandeis University. This project is funded by OPRE Child Care Partnership Grant. And then we are interested in looking at how state policy changes regarding the redetermination process in Massachusetts affected stability in child care subsidy use and care arrangement. But what we found out from this data is that Massachusetts was one of the states that have high representation of Hispanic families. So about 30% of subsidy users are Hispanic children. So therefore, among many other research questions that we are doing, we are interested in examining the patterns of child care subsidy use and then their care arrangement among Hispanic children. And then we will also estimate this child care supply and demand. So we want to map the location of subsidy participating centers to the estimated number of CCDF income eligible children across the state and then by service region. And then we're going to see how the ratio of this child care supply to demand differ by race and ethnicity. So whether Hispanic children are living in the area where, how many number of subsidy participating providers are. So most critical areas of knowledge, I probably echo what Colleen said earlier. So in my opinion, and then based on my research, one of the critical areas of knowledge base is the type of care that Hispanic families choose, and then understanding factors affecting those choices. So I'm mostly doing secondary data analysis, and then I probably echo what Colleen said in quantitative language, but it's just kind of the similar. So when you look at the literature, so what we know is there seems some consistency in research finding that Hispanic families are less likely to use database care compared to other racial groups, even after controlling for family income, their employment, and immigration status or other major characteristics. But however, what drives choices are largely unknown. So when you look at the literature, and in my study talks about this cultural preference to family or relative-based care, but recent literature began focusing on how family socioeconomic factors are driving this care decision. So also considering that many Hispanic families are immigrants, it is also important to consider how their care choice change as children get older, or as they become more familiar to child care system in the U.S. or acclimated to the U.S. culture. So, but because there's no longitudinal studies that have done so far in this area, so this area is largely unknown. So speaking of immigration status, I just want to talk a little bit more about that. So it is critical to think about how immigration status affects care choices. So immigration status, for me, can be a proxy for many different things. It can be such as unfamiliarity or distrust to U.S. system, or if you are undocumented, it can be a fear of detection and subsequent deportation. Or it could be lack of knowledge on what is available, or whether their children are eligible for those benefits, or simply it's maybe ineligibility for a publicly funded program. So there has been some work, including my recent work, that looked at how family immigration status affects care choice. And these studies generally find, even after controlling those factors like mother's primary language or the length of time they stayed in the U.S. or in the U.S., the immigration status significantly affects the choice of care. So what is unknown now is why this is the case. So we only speculate, and then I hope that so some of you here maybe kind of provide some explanation or speculation on that as well. So maybe we may call that it may be their cultural preference or their precarious immigration status. But however, especially on the policy standpoint, I think it is critical to know that whether this means that whether they are unaware of existing resources or lack of access or ineligibility for those resources. So based on this current status of knowledge, I think the future research should consider examining some sort of pathway through or to what extent these various factors contribute to care choices. Also whether those pathway or relative importance of each factor change over time as children get older or as family socioeconomic circumstance changes. So we're all aware data is very limited to answer those questions. But it is important question to ask because it relates to what policy implication we can kind of draw from. So if it's a really cultural preference to family or relative-based care or family's capability of arranging those care, then encouraging just center-based care may not be wouldn't be that effective. But on the other hand, but we will have to think more critically about how we can kind of make this family community-based care more effective or some sort of like educational. But if this is rather due to like lack of financial resources or their kind of work schedule change over time all the time or lack of quality care where they live, then policymakers or administrators should be, we should consider the ways to kind of increase access to center-based care. So, so at the last point, I just want to echo what many other researchers point out, that increased access to public programs, just to make sure that there are childcare providers in the neighborhood that are high quality, affordable, or culturally competent, so that these Hispanic families can have kind of options to choose from.
All right, so I think we're going to move into discussion questions. I hope some of what Colleen took maybe generated some questions from the audience. And this is a reminder to the people on the webinar that you can submit your questions through the chat box. We've generated our own list here, but this is definitely meant to be a conversation. So I think the first question that we wanted to pose to Colleen and stuff has to do with this issue of complexity, which we've now mentioned several times. And the question is related to how to balance the issue of complexity with also staying focused in the research. And so we wanted to hear your thoughts about how you've approached your research in terms of this balance, staying true to this idea that the process is complex, while also staying focused in your research, enough so that way we can truly detect patterns and, understand the characteristics, which specific characteristics may be most important in terms of influencing parents' decision-making process. So I'm not sure, Colleen or Yunsuk, who wants to?
So I think I'll start on this one. Yunsuk and I kind of chatted ahead of time. So, okay. And so part of this question was about childcare being complex, decision-making being complex and dynamic. And so I was going to help us think a little bit more about how these decisions are really dynamic, and was going to give an example from my research. And so, when we think about how this decision-making process is dynamic, we have to think how this happens over time, too. That as socio-historical, socio-cultural kinds of things shift in communities, how does that then shape how parents are making decisions? And so when I was looking at this question, I was thinking about having done research in the same community over the last 6 years, a couple different projects, but being in the same community and watching how things like the Great Recession have impacted families there. And when I initially began working in the community back in 2009, in many of the families, the women were, so in two-parent families, where the women, the mothers, were working outside the home because many of the men were working in construction. And following the Great Recession, there weren't that many jobs in construction, and what that meant for child care. And so sometimes it meant more parental care, and sometimes it meant care like Head Start and then parental care as wraparound care. Now, being in that same community, many of the fathers are, quote unquote, back to work, different families, but similar demographic characteristics. Many of the fathers are back to work, and some of the mothers are working, some of them are staying at home. But what's interesting is that I've been learning that for some of them, with the fathers working, they're earning just above what would qualify them for Head Start. And so the mom is taking care of the children, but in that community there are high-quality child care options available, but they're sort of just above that threshold for what they would need to be earning to qualify. So just, again, thinking about the dynamics and how these shift even over time in the same community. Thinking about balancing our approach, we really obviously need to continue to rely on evidence in the field in terms of both these large nationally representative studies like the National Study of Early Care and Education, but also thinking about more nuanced kind of qualitative studies to understand what's going on underneath these larger trends that we're seeing. So Yunsak, I don't know if you want to chime in with some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. So I think that this so child care decision is a complex and dynamic process for all families, not just Hispanic families. So they're all different, and they're all different need and everything. But so I just thought about what kind of the difference for Hispanic families, and then what kind of this heterogeneous need for this population, and then I can so for me it's kind of three things. I mean, you guys can add more. So one is there are very different ethnicity among, there's a lot of different ethnic groups in Hispanic population. And the second one is different socioeconomic status. And of course, and then also different immigration status. Because of that, there's a different level of acculturation. So, when you do the research, and then also, so these all can kind of lead to different conclusions about how they can choose child care. So, for me as a researcher, especially when you do look at the data, it's kind of important to find kind of overall patterns and characteristics of this Hispanic population, how they kind of what kind of child care, how they choose the child care they're using. So, but at the same time, to address kind of this special need or characteristic of this kind of heterogeneous group, some sort of subgroup analysis. So there's some work has been done on Mexican immigrants or other Hispanic population, or more like a younger kind of age group of children or older age group. So those kind of subgroup analysis would be great. And then also Colleen mentioned about this dynamic process. I think change over time. So I just want to emphasize again that some sort of longitudinal studies that has been done. Yeah. So those studies will provide great information about how these families make decisions based on this dynamic process.
So if I could add to the complexity, we talk about how complex child care decision making is, and especially look around the room, some of the folks who've done work in general in child care, there is a lot of complexity, as Aaron spoke about, and others spoke about, Colleen and others. But you also think one of the things that we've done within the work of the center has been to really also try and emphasize the heterogeneity of the Hispanic population. So you've got child care decision making and the complexities and all the different factors that people have been talking about that go into it. Then you also have a very heterogeneous population. We're not all one, homogeneous group. And so you've got these different aspects of what are those different dimensions of being Hispanic in terms of country of origin, your recency of immigration, your language proficiency, that all feed into some of these issues around access, availability, around your social networks. We've got a lot of work going on that you'll hear about at the end around emerging versus established communities. If I'm Hispanic in an emerging community, there are probably less social networks and fewer resources available in that community. So all those things, so it's almost like 3D chess and 3 or 4 or 5D chess, where you have just the normal messiness of child care decision making. Then you have this very heterogeneous population that you have to wrap your heads around trying to figure out. So what's the subgroup? Is the subgroup Mexican Americans, as Yun Suk mentioned, because it's the largest critical mass of Hispanic? Do you also cap that all those different we call them the magic 10 variables that have come out of some of the work of the ACF Hispanic work group, and then we did a data elements brief on it. So how do you try and capture this dimensionality that gets at that heterogeneous Hispanic population? But how do you do that in a way that doesn't end up being overly complex to where you throw your hands up and say, I don't know what I'm going to do here to make sense out of all this mess? So that's, I think, one of the big challenges that I want to throw out, kind of building on what Yun Suk and Colleen have pounded on. And Gina, you look like you're just eager to, which is always a good thing.
I want to make sure I didn't have to write it down on a piece of paper because I was a little nervous about it. You know, I think it is enormously complex, but when I've been doing this work, there are such commonalities, too. So it's like, yes, people are different, but there's generally a consistency across folks about more discomfort with center-based care, for instance, in college. I mean, so I think to think about the cross-commonalities helps. It may make it the fourth dimension of chess, but it also allows us to think about the themes and the things that we've learned across groups. And I'm really glad you mentioned what you call the emergency communities, because I also think we also don't think about the demand. You know, my experience talking to families, what I call low-density Latino population experience is not that different than a low-density Pakistani or Nigerian or anybody else, because there's just not enough of them to create the demand, to have the social networks, to have a sense of people. I mean, I remember working in Chicago, and the Pakistani family said, well, if we were like the Mexicans, we could expect to have somebody who speaks our language at the desk, but we don't have enough of us. So I think thinking about the contextual work that Colleen was talking about of who else is around you and how that shifts, because local neighborhoods massively change over 10 years. So you may have a large Latino population in the community one time, work that Julia Gelada at Urban has been doing, you know, that suddenly is a very diverse community and have a different set of parameters in terms of what you can access in that community. So I guess what I'm trying to think about is how to not make Latino families as unique in a way, because there's common themes that we can learn across all groups, and think about which of the pillars of commonalities we have and which are the things that are unique, which probably is also going to be common with somebody. So I'm not sure if that muddies the water or adds another layer.
No, I think it's really helpful. I mean, it's the same thing when you look at quality in either classroom quality. How much is unique versus how much is specific to dual language learners? You know, from a cultural linguistic diversity, there's some that's fundamentally just good quality is good quality, but there's also some that's maybe a unique contribution on top of it. That's kind of somewhat of a parallel there.
Yeah, I think that this is a good segue into the next discussion question, which is about this issue, you know, the general sort of takeaway tagline that has been floating around in the research recently about underutilization among Hispanic families, especially among immigrant populations, and trying to, you know, that's the sort of maybe one of the pillars or the pieces that, you know, we're trying to unpack. And then we thought we would ask Colleen and Yun Suk maybe to talk a little bit about how their research has sort of explored this more deeply and helped us to understand maybe some exceptions to these types of patterns in terms of subgroups. I know we've mentioned a little bit about this already, but if you have other examples in terms of subgroups or specific contexts where these sort of general pillars that we're talking about don't necessarily hold. So I'll turn to Yun Suk first.
Yeah, I can start. So I actually have to think about this question a little bit because so when I do research, it's more about, you know, the data analysis, second data analysis. So I try to find more like a generalizable findings rather than exception. So I thought about, you know, how I can actually answer or helpful in this question is. So in terms of research, I think we maybe, you know, so when you do research, you have to think about who you are comparing to. So when you say, okay, Hispanic families use underutilized center-based care, then you have to think about which group we are comparing to. So when you look, so in general, results from the quantitative study shows that even after controlling for their income, education, or employment, Latina mothers are less likely to use center-based care. So that's kind of the consensus. And then, among subsidy, and then I looked at child care subsidy users. And then in our study, using Massachusetts data, it's a preliminary, but they are more likely to use, so among those who use child care subsidy, then they are also more likely to use family daycare rather than center-based care. And then I looked at among children, then what about children who are between age 3 and 5, who are, so there's more like a debate on which types of child care is better for infant and toddler. But for the age 3 and 5, we probably, I don't know, I can't dare to say this, agree that center-based care maybe help with their education and development. So, so when I looked at that group, they were, among the Hispanic population, they were using more center-based care than family daycare. But when you compare with other ethnic groups, white, Black, and Asian, they're a lot more likely to use family daycare, and they're less likely to use center-based care. So, but however, so what's missing here? So I thought about what we haven't done so far, and then it's really about counterfactual groups. Which groups we are comparing to. So when you have like, okay, there's working mothers from different ethnic groups, and then working mothers, and they're all born in the U.S. and then all have the same education. So when you have those same groups, whether the Hispanic mothers, Latina mothers, will be more likely to center-based care. So I don't know. So that's kind of the, I think, unanswered question that we need to look at. I don't know whether. I don't know, maybe Colleen, you can actually add a little bit about, so okay, so now what is the exceptions that we can think of?
Yeah, so when I was thinking about this question, I was sort of thinking, well, so if this underutilization exists, I mean, to me, I'm thinking about, so why is this happening? Is it that services aren't aligning with what families are looking for? Is it that services don't exist? Families don't know about services that might exist? And it made me think about, in the current project that I'm working on that I shared a bit about, there are 2 programs in the community that are available to low-income families, and in this community primarily Latino families. And one of the programs, and they both target 4-year-olds, one of the programs, they always have a waiting list. No issues recruiting families. And the other program, recently I learned that they're having issues filling up their classrooms. And they're geographically in the same area. In some cases, their classrooms are side by side in one of the public schools. And so in talking with the directors of both programs, and the directors know each other, right, so they're talking about this issue and trying to figure it out. And so some of the things we talked about, too, is the program where that is full, that they are completely embedded in the community, that there are a lot of wraparound services that go beyond child care. The teachers speak Spanish and English, and that's not necessarily always the case with the other program. And so now those 2 programs are sort of working together to try and figure this out. But again, if you were just in that program that wasn't filling out well enough, and you weren't willing to sort of go out and try and figure out, well, what's going on, you might just think that, well, families aren't interested. And in talking with families in the community, in this particular community, what's interesting, what's coming out, is that some of these parents would love to have care as early as when their kids are 2 years old. It's not available. So again, not oversimplifying based on maybe some of these pillars that we're thinking about, and as practitioners working in the community, really trying to think about why is this happening, what we're seeing? I would also say, if we're thinking about sort of exceptions in previous reports that have been done, there were a number of mothers who were looking for care for their children, couldn't necessarily find it. They were on waiting lists. They wanted to be employed. And so I think that there certainly are exceptions to this. And so I think it's just being careful about what are these things that maybe we know across the board, but not then making assumptions that may be wrong about that. So still always asking how, why, what's happening. So.
No, I'd echo that. And, in addition to all the factors that you mentioned, Colleen, in terms of, and June, I think that it really gets at that kind of under the hood aspect of trying to understand what some of these patterns mean. And because I always come back to the example of the early literature looking at underutilization and inferring attributions to cultural preference, and that was the politically correct. We all assumed that we figured it out, and then realizing some of these factors around the access and availability and the the cultural competence of the staff, and I don't think you mentioned the flexibility in hours, because a lot of times Hispanic families, low-income Hispanic families have long working hours. I know for me, for my own child care preferences, sometimes those flexibility in hours, if I can get from here home and pick up my daughter. But there's another dynamic that kind of came out of some of the work. I know we have some of our colleagues from First Bible and LA who are at least were registered on. But when they invested in their $600 million expansion of universal preschool, one of the dynamics that came out of that was that in looking back at the patterns of attendance that you had, forget the family child care or whether it's licensed or informal child care, because those are two different potential options. But center-based care, those families who chose center-based care for Latino children, the children had lower attendance rates. And so it was another one of those situations where the easiest interpretation was, well, they're not committed to having their children attend, or between child factors and family factors. And it made me step back and think, well, do we really know? And that's when I wanted to turn to Colleen, because it's like, can we get under the hood of what's happening with some of these decisions? Is it that they don't feel like their kids should be in the center-based care for 5 days a week, 6 or 8 hours a day, that they utilize it for purposes of what meets their needs, but then they spend more time with their children? I don't know, and I don't want to go the opposite direction and assume that it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but it kind of speaks to this issue, this theme of being careful not to fall back on some of these oversimplifications and assumptions of, we've had 3 different questions about underutilization I think we just addressed, but making sure that we're not assuming it's cultural preference, not assuming it's, access availability, but that we are open to being understanding and trying to unpack that. And once again, Gina.
Just a quick one, just to prove your point. We did some work with DCPS, public school pre-K, and the attendance rates were highest among Latino families. So another point to not oversimplify and not presume, because again, the distinction between one community and another, between one group and another. So that's part of the challenge, is we have so much of this really good work locally, and we wanted to do these national patterns, and until we have multiple points.
Right, and how do you make that a higher rate of attendance? Is that a good thing? Is it?
Right, exactly. So equally confusing, but just counterpoint.
Putting another plug in for being careful about making a pillar of the statement that Hispanics underutilize child care. I think we really have to make distinctions between ethnicity, country of origin, immigration status, language status. Are we talking about as an ELL? Might have different preferences. Are we talking about immigrant status? So some of the studies that make us think that Hispanics are attending less center-based care are really based on Mexican families. And so a lot of that statement really needs to be low-income, low-educated Mexican families. That's definitely true. Not all true for Miami-Dade County, Florida, where you have lots of Cuban immigrants and Central American and South American immigrants. So we don't see as much evidence of that in the South Florida context as you do with other kinds of Latinos. So just knowing that we need to be careful. Are we talking about immigration status? Are we talking about country of origin? Are we talking about language? Are we talking about Hispanicness? We have to drill down a little bit more.
Yeah. I think there are a few things that could be added to the conversation. Just to echo what the woman in the Bethesda said about high attendance in preschools, in public preschools in DC. Qualitative research in the K-12 world would say that Latino families are often quite trusting in the system, right? That I'm sending my children to be well-fed and ready to behave, and I'm expecting that you're going to send them back to be educated, right? It's actually more common in upper middle class white families to be very distrusting of the system, for better or worse, right? So many Latino families are sending their children to school actually where there's a lot of inequities, and these inequities aren't being questioned in the way that they often need to be by the parents because of this cultural difference in how those are perceived. That's the first thing. It might be different, I'm sure, in the early education and care world in terms of preferences and have children be with their families as well as in school, but in terms of the family's questioning of quality, I think that that is something that falls more on the system, and that's something else that hasn't come up a lot today. So this assumption that underutilization of center-based care is problematic. It is, but maybe just to be provocative. Not always. I think that there are reasons to really think about the capacity of the system and the quality in so many of these centers, often due to the working conditions of the teachers there. So that while there might not be, so Deborah Phillips might say, there can be some very subtle social exclusion and instability within these centers that aren't attended to. So if we're going to, as you said, think about what our policy implications are going to be for these families, a direct push to get them into more centers, or as New York City is doing, increasing public pre-K slots. But I just think there should be a little bit of caution around that conversation. Yeah, and the capacity of the system right now to really serve children well, and what we're doing not to just increase this access and make sure what access is there is being utilized, but that what we're offering is truly going to enhance children's development and not too much the other way around.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, I think that was a major question thought for me when I was walking away from doing my dissertation, when I was looking at this question and thinking about, okay, so there are two ways you could go about this. You could increase, aim to increase center-based enrollment, or we could think about trying to improve quality in home-based care settings, and that could be a whole other webinar in and of itself, trying to think about when you have licensed and unlicensed and regulated, unregulated, how you go about sort of simulating that, those improvements in quality in home-based settings. And I don't know if Colleen or Yunsook or people in Bethesda have any. I think those are great points. I don't know if there are other thoughts about this.
Yunsook and I, we had chatted about this a little bit, and it was in relation, I think, to maybe the next question. But really thinking about kind of meeting families where they're at, right? That it's not sort of like, oh, let's get everybody enrolled in center-based care. Let's think about what actually works for those families and working a bit more in partnership. And again, obviously, I'm doing stuff in smaller communities, and when we think about things, scaling things up, what does that look like? That's a whole other question. But maybe it is a focus on improving the quality. It's a both and, it's a either or, right? So maybe it is more enrollment in center-based care, but it's also continuing to work towards improving the quality of home-based care as well as family friend and neighbor care.
Well, I think that the capacity of the system point that was just made, I think, is really critical, because as we're seeing more and more expansion of early care options, whether it's child care options and/or center-based care, this notion, and people touched on it earlier, around the capacity of the cultural competence. Is this a setting where I want my child? Adam, you mentioned kind of the DLL issue in terms of curricular instruction and language of instruction. So if I have a choice between a center-based program that has little to no Spanish language instruction for my child who's predominantly Spanish-speaking, why would I send my child there? Now, there may be other reasons in terms of some of the services, and people have mentioned some comments from online in terms of kids with special needs, issues around transportation. I mean, all these different issues of the positive things for center-based care that the resources might be provided, but it also has to be done in a context in which I'm going to view it as something that's going to be a positive thing for my child, not something that I can go there. I can't speak to the, as a parent, speak to them because I don't speak their language. They don't speak my child's language. They don't provide services to my child. So, it is a very complex issue, but it really speaks to the importance of making sure that as we think about expanding these options, as we think about quality in general, we also think about quality within the context of culturally and linguistically diverse families.
So I know we only have maybe 3 or 4 minutes left. Mike, I wanted to check in to see if there were any other questions from your end from the webinar, or if I should leave off.
Well, I think we woven in a number of the questions that have come in, on issues around quality and on underutilization. So we're good.
We're good to go. Okay. So I know we had, I think, 3 more slides here of discussion questions. We were worried about running out in terms of time. But I might just end with one that I think is an interesting, the second bullet here, which is a conversation that Colleen and took. And, when we're talking about planning for this webinar and thinking about all the barriers that have been mentioned today in terms of immigration status and language and thinking of availability and all the things that keep stopping families from finding the care that they want. And so I think we have maybe 1 minute before we end, but I just wanted to maybe ask Colleen and Suk to say a few words, their thoughts about how to approach this from a strengths-based perspective. If you can do that in an elevator speech, I'm not sure. There might be a lot to add.
I'll go really fast. So really thinking about what families are doing instead of what they're not doing, right? That's our notion of strengths-based. Let's focus on what is good and what is working. And when we think about Latino families, we can think about things like sharing information across their social networks, resilience, strong work ethic. And I think when we think about what is it that families are doing, it sheds light on what's not happening maybe in the system, right? And these larger, this gets back to the conversation we just had, these larger structural issues. And so instead of sort of blaming, which often happens to families, really thinking about what are they doing, what are the strengths of these families, and how can we capitalize on that in the system that we have that may be slightly broken. So I think just kind of trying to look, again, ecologically across these areas in terms of the individual families and kind of what's happening in the system.
Great. I'll turn to you, Suk. I don't know if you have anything you want to say.
Yeah. So I think that, as I mentioned earlier, if it's their preference, to choose family or relative-based care over center-based care, and then if they have capacity of arranging it, I think we really have to, critically think about how we can encourage that, because if that actually meets their need, if it's what they prefer, so it's their strength. They have those kind of social networks that can help them. So what I think, but also, the Mike's comments of oversimplifying, but we also have to at the same time aware that these structural issues. So when we consider this their cultural preference, whether we are actually kind of seeing enough, other kind of structural issues that, kind of availability, center-based care, or it's cost, or it's location. So yeah, I think they should go kind of the together, each other.
Well said in 30 seconds. Okay, with that, I think we're at the 1 o'clock mark. I just want to move on, if I can, to the. We have, I think, 3 thank you slides, but I'll pause here. Our contact information is on this page. I want to thank Colleen and you, Suk. I want to thank Julia for helping to prepare all of the logistics for today. Thanks to Mike. And we also wanted to let you know that we have some upcoming webinars and presentations in September and October that will be held through the Hispanic Center. So if you liked what you saw today, you can go on the website and sign up for the listserv to get more information about those events. We'll also be sending out a follow-up email with an attachment of today's slides and a link to today's presentation. So thank you again, everyone. We're going to sign off and enjoy your afternoon or your morning, depending on where you're calling in from.
Thank you all.
Take care. Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.